All right, so in this class, I'm going to introduce you to inflation and issues of unemployment. As you've seen, it's just an introduction to inflation and unemployment, which will at least give you some background knowledge on inflation and unemployment. All right. Now, by the end of this, we should be able to understand what inflation is. We should be able to measure inflation. We should be able to know the causes and then the effects. When I say effects, I mean the consequences of inflation. Then we should be able to understand the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Then finally, we should be able to understand measures that policymakers like the government can put in place to curb inflation. So when we talk about inflation, what is inflation? Inflation is generally a sustained increase in the general level of prices over time, all right? So we can confidently say that inflation occurs when general price levels, when we talk about general price level, it means the price of everything. For instance, the price of goods and services, the price of labor, the price of capital, etc. So when general levels of prices rise over time, so it doesn't mean that prices will rise this month, prices will fall this month, it will remain at where it is. The following month, it remains at where it is. Then the following month, maybe it increases. That is not inflation. Inflation is a sustained increase. So when prices increases over time, sustained increase in general price level, we call it inflation. Now, we basically have two types of inflation. We have that kind of inflation that is small and then it looks like it is going slowly. So when inflation is small and it is increasing slowly, we can say that that inflation is creeping. So whenever we are talking about creeping inflation, it is inflation that refers to small and gradual rises in prices over time, okay? But when we have a situation where prices are galloping or prices are accelerating, we can say that it is hyperinflation. We can say that it's hyperinflation. Now, how do we measure inflation? Now, how do we measure inflation? So basically, there are two measures for inflation. We can compute inflation by measuring it by changes in consumer price index, okay? That's the first one. And then we can measure inflation by looking at changes in the GDP deflator, all right? We can measure inflation by changes in the GDP deflator. So we measure inflation by changes in CPI. We also measure inflation by changes in the GDP deflator. Now, what is CPI? So CPI, or in essence, what we call consumer price index, okay? Consumer price index for any period measures the cost in that period of a standard basket of consumption goods and services relative to the cost of the same basket of consumption goods and services in a fixed year called the base year. So here, one of the things I want you to know is that, for instance, in, let's say, 2010, okay, let's say you bought 5 shirts at 20 cedis each. okay? And then let's say you bought 2 trousers at, let's say, 40 cedis each. That means that the total amount of money you spent in 2010 on your shirt and trousers will be 5 times 20. That is the total amount you spend on the shirt, plus 2 times 40. That is the total amount you spend on the trousers, okay? That is the total amount you spend on the trousers. Now, let's assume that in 2020, the shirt price is now 30 cedis. And then the trouser price is now, let's say, 50 cedis each. So the implication here is that if you want to look at the amount of money you would have spent on the same 5 shirts and the same 2 trousers in 2020, it will be 5 shirts times 30 cedis now, okay, plus 2 trousers times 40 cedis now. Now, what are we trying to do? We are trying to look at between the 2 years, how your cost of living has changed. Now, this is reasonable because if you want to know how your cost of living has changed, you have to maintain a fixed basket of goods to measure that. When I say you are maintaining a fixed basket of goods to measure this, what I simply mean is that we still maintain the 5 shirts and 2 trousers, but now we measure it in terms of the new prices. So what it means is that the old quantities doesn't change, okay? If the quantities change in this calculation, it will be difficult to know how much your cost of living has increased. Maybe if quantities change, it could be as a result of the fact that the quantities has changed. That is why you are spending more, but not necessarily because prices have risen. That is why you are spending more. So to avoid these doubts, all right, I think here is 50 cedis, sorry. To avoid these doubts, we compute the value of the same basket of goods in the current year as well as the base year, all right? So if you look at this formula clearly, up here we have old quantity current price, old quantity current price. So that is sigma PN Q0, okay, divided by, here we have old quantity, old price, old quantity, old price. So that is sigma P0 Q0 times 100%, okay? So I think 5 times 30 is 150, plus 2 times 50 is 100, all over 5 times 20 is 100, then 2 times 40 is 80, all right? So I'm sure if you do your calculations, it will be 250 divided by 180. If you multiply it by 100%, I think you get 138.9%. Now, what does this mean? What this simply means is that between the base year and then the current year, prices have risen by 38.9%. It means prices have risen by 38.9%. That is what it means. Which also means that, of course, your cost of living has also increased by 38%. Now, one of the things I want you to remember is that because CPI, it measures only consumption goods and services. Note that. That means that CPI is about C. It's not about I. It's not about J. It's about C. Okay. So it measures consumption, goods, and services. Okay. Now, because of that, what it means is that when consumers import to consume, okay, it is part of the calculation of CPI. When consumers import to consume, what it means is that it will be part of the computation of CPI. Okay. Now let's go to GDP deflator. Now, for GDP deflator, it takes a different approach. Now, GDP deflator first of all, the GDP deflator does not assume fixed goods, but instead, the GDP deflator wants to know the value of all goods and services in this year divided by the value of the same goods and services, assuming we bought it in the base year. So what it means is that GDP deflator divides the nominal spending. Nominal spending means current price, current quantities. When you multiply, you get nominal spending. And divides it by real spending. Real spending in this current year means that we will assume that prices have not changed. So real spending in this year, if you want to do the real spending this year, you take the base year price and multiply it by the current year quantity. So in essence, GDP deflator assumes sigma PN QN, that's the nominal spending, divided by sigma P0 QN, that is the real spending. Real spending means that it would have taken out the inflationary effect. That is why we are assuming P0, even though we are in current year quantity, times 100%. One of the things I want you to also note is that when it comes to GDP deflator, it measures the prices of all goods and services, whether it is consumer goods, investment goods, government expenditure, and even exports, all right? And even exports. But it does not include imports. The reason is that GDP deflator talks about GDP, that is gross domestically produced goods. Okay, so that means that imports cannot be part of the calculation of GDP deflator. Now, here, this means that there can be three basic differences between the GDP deflator and CPI. Number one, CPI measures only consumer goods. GDP deflator measures the price index for all goods. Number two, GDP deflator assumes current basket of goods, but CPI assumes base year basket of goods and it is fixed, all right? Number three, GDP deflator does not include imports in its calculation, but CPI includes imports in its calculation. So these are the two basic ways that we can measure inflation. Now, up until now, if you are following what I'm saying, you realize that, you see, when it comes to inflation, we always make reference to base year, all right? So if you compute CPI and then you have like 130%, we all know that the price index for the base year is always 100%. So then we will say that prices have risen by 30%. But what if you want to compute year-on-year inflation? Let's say the base year for Ghana was, let's say, 2010. And when we compute the CPI for 2020 and we have 130, what it means is that the prices between 2010 and 2020 have risen by 30%. Now the question is, what if I want to compute inflation between 2020 and just last year, 2019? What it will then mean is that I'll be doing year-on-year inflation rate. And how do we compute that? So it is the price index in this period minus the price index in previous period over the price index in previous period times 100%. So if the price index for, let's say, 2020 was 120 and the price index for 2019 was 110, okay, this will be the computation to be 120 minus 110 over 110 times 100%. And this is the inflation that has occurred between 2020 and 2019. Okay. If you look at this 120 as the price index for 2020, it means that there has been an increase of price of 20% between 2020 and the base year. And if you look at this 110 for 2019, what it means is that there have been a price increase of 10% in 2019 from the base year 2010. But if you want to look at year on year, like between 2020 and 2019, this is how we do the computation. Now, the question we must ask ourselves is, CPI calculation of inflation and then GDP deflator calculation of inflation, which of them is the best? Now, because in our part of the world, consumption forms a major part of aggregate expenditure, most of the times when policymakers are making decisions, they make decisions on the CPI measure of inflation. Because in our part of the world, consumption is a very big component of aggregate expenditure. But of course, it doesn't make CPI measurement the best. I'm just saying that in our part of the world, that is the situation. Now, what are the causes of inflation? Number one, we have demand pull inflation. Number two, we have cost push inflation. Number three, we have expectation induced inflation. Now, let's start with the demand pull inflation. So, when it comes to demand pull inflation, we go back to our aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. Okay, this is demand pull inflation. We go back to our aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. So this is aggregate demand and this is aggregate supply curve. Now, this is AD and this is AS. Okay. Now, if there is an expansionary fiscal policy, okay, once there is expansionary fiscal policy, and then once there is expansionary monetary policy, what it means is that it will boost aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will shift that way. It will shift outward, right? Now, holding aggregate supply constant, what it means is that the general price level is going to fall. all right, quantity or income or output. So here, the general price levels are going to rise, sorry. General price levels are going to rise because aggregate demand has increased, okay? And this is what we call the demand pool inflation. When aggregate demand rises and aggregate supply remains constant, the general price levels rise, and this will lead to demand pool inflation. The second one, so this is demand pool inflation. The second form of inflation is the cost push inflation. Cost push inflation. So here we have aggregate supply, we have aggregate demand, we have aggregate supply. Okay. Now, you see, for cost push inflation, it occurs when there is an increase in cost of factors of production. It occurs when there is an increase in cost of factors of production. So once the cost of factors of production, as in the cost of land, the cost of labor, the cost of capital, when those elements increase, what it means is that it's going to reduce supply, okay? It's going to reduce aggregate supply. It's going to reduce aggregate supply. And once aggregate supply decreases, prices will shoot up, all right? Once aggregate supply decreases, prices are going to shoot up, okay? Prices are going to shoot up. So this is what we call the cost push inflation, all right? The cost push inflation. Now, the next one is expectations induced effect. So here, if people expect that next year prices are going to rise, okay, what they will do is that they will demand more. Let's listen carefully. If people expect that next year prices are going to rise, they will demand more now so that they will avoid purchasing it at a higher price next year. So what does that lead to? That will lead to an immediate increase in price because aggregate demand will increase immediately because they are all trying to avoid paying more next year. So aggregate demand will immediately shoot up, and that will cause inflation. On the other hand, if suppliers realize that prices are going to rise next year, what will happen is that these suppliers are also going to reduce supply because they will reserve the goods and sell it later at a higher price. So they're also going to reduce supply. So this is what is going to happen. If both consumers and suppliers perceive that next year prices are going to rise, this is what is going to happen. What is going to happen is that demand is going to increase and then supply is going to decrease. All right. So let's name here the initial equilibrium here. So this was the AD, the first one. So let me name it AD1, and it will shift this way to AD2. AD2, it will shift this way. And then the supply was AS1, and it will contract to AS2, all right? So this is going to be, so this AS2, so this is going to be the new price, okay? Prices are going to skyrocket. because of expectations. So these are the three reasons why inflation may occur. All right. These are the three reasons why inflation may occur. Now, what is the consequence of inflation? The consequence of inflation is that number one, people are going to incur shoe leather costs. When I say shoe leather costs, it is more or less like a figurative speech, okay? So shoe leather cost means that once prices are rising, people will be going around, they will be spending time, they will be spending money, going around, taking transportation here and there, just to make sure that they get the best price. Now, once they are incurring this cost in searching for best price, these costs is not because they are contributing to economic activity, but this cost is because they are just searching for best price. So what then it means is that they will incur these costs by trying to search for best price. And that is what we call the shoe leather cost, okay? Walking around, taking transportation to get best price. Now, the next one is menu cost. So usually, for organizations, most organizations that use price list or price tags, once there's rapid inflation, that means every time they have to be changing their price tags. Every time they have to be changing their price tags. And once they change their price tags, always, what it will mean then is that they are also incurring costs of which it doesn't contribute to any economic output, all right? Because they are just changing price tags, okay? And that is what we also refer to as the menu cost, the menu cost. The next one is redistribution effect, all right? Now, once there is inflation, there will be redistribution effect of income, number one, from lenders to borrowers. So usually, during periods of inflation, you realize that borrowers are the people who are going to gain. Okay, borrowers are going to gain because the real cost of borrowing will fall. Remember that anytime you are talking about real cost or real interest rate, we would remove any inflationary effect from it. Okay, so once there's inflation, people are going, the borrowers, people who have borrowed money, they are going to gain. All right. Of course, because if they use their money for businesses, you realize that they'll get more money because prices have risen and then they can easily pay out their debt. So in periods of inflation, there is redistribution effect of income from lenders to borrowers because borrowers are going to gain. Number two, there is also a redistribution effect of income from those who dwell on fixed income to those who income adjust with inflation. What this simply means is that during periods of inflation, okay, people who have fixed income, their purchasing power is going to fall. Because if your income is fixed, irrespective of the prices of goods and services, what it means is that when there is inflation, you are going to lose big time. But for people whose income is a direct function of the amount of goods and services they sell, like people who operate their own shops and they don't work for anybody, okay? For such people, once there's inflation, they are going to get more money because the price of goods have risen. Number three, there is also a redistribution effect from taxpayers to the government. There is also a redistribution effect from taxpayers to the government. What it means is that once there are increases in prices, okay, our nominal income is going to increase. Nominal, not real income. Nominal income is going to increase because of inflation. And once nominal income increases, it means that your income can push you into a higher tax bracket because the higher your income, the higher your tax rate, okay? So it will unnecessarily push you into a higher tax bracket for government to charge you more tax, all right? So that is also a redistribution effect of inflation from taxpayers to government. unless government deliberately takes steps to adjust the tax rate because of the inflation, so that it doesn't, people's new level of income because of inflation doesn't push them into a higher tax bracket. Number four, another consequence of inflation is loss of international competitiveness. Loss of international competitiveness. Now, what this simply means is that once there's inflation, local goods become expensive, which means that we cannot export more. It will discourage export because our goods will be expensive to the outside world. On the other hand, for Ghanaians here, even to them, goods are expensive. So Ghanaians will also now begin to import. Okay, they will also begin to import because Ghanaian goods are expensive. So it will let us lose our international competitiveness because we are exporting less and importing more. All right. So this will bring us to an introduction of inflation. So next, I'm going to talk about the relationship between inflation and unemployment.